Hey, good morning, Anakin. It's Mr. Clark here. I was asked by Mrs. Clark if I would be a special guest lecturer for the material in Chapter 12, and I said I'd love the Civil War, so I'd love to kind of go over the material. So I'm just going to go over sort of the highlight points here from the first section of your notes for Chapter 12. Sort of getting into the opening days of the Civil War, and I trust that you got the basic gist of everything that went down leading up to this. So I'm just going to kind of go slide by slide. I'm not going to talk about everything like point by point. I was looking at this slide here. You know why most of the South wanted to fight the Civil War at this point. They wanted to protect the institution of slavery. They wanted to be able to like buy and own black people. The North wanted to stop that from happening. Now, as soon as Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1864, that's what sparked Southern states immediately leaving, because Abraham Lincoln was saying all along when he was running for president, when I become president, slavery is dead. Like I'm going to kill it in one way or the other. And there were 7 states, if I did the math right: South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas all immediately seceded. No shots fired. They left America. These 4 states up here, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, they chose not to yet. There was a lot of debate. Some of them felt as if they might be able to work with Abraham Lincoln. They weren't quite ready to leave America quite yet. And that's going to lead to like the opening shots of the Civil War. The Civil War officially is going to begin at a federal fort called Fort Sumter. If you look at this map over here to the left, just this little edge over here, Fort Sumter is just off the coast of South Carolina down here. As soon as Abraham Lincoln became president, all sorts of different federal installations like forts, banks, gun depots were getting taken over by Southern citizens, and there was pretty much no resistance. Like nobody was stopping them. So if a bunch of like armed hooligans came running into a military installation, the soldiers were just like, yeah, we're not fighting you. You do what you're going to do. We're not going to stop you. But that all ended at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was pretty much just a fort on an island just off the coast of South Carolina in the Atlantic Ocean. Wasn't real far out there. And it had a number of soldiers there, and it appeared as if the South wanted to take that fort from the federal government. And Abraham Lincoln said, enough is enough. You can't have this. We're not going to let you take this fort from us. But there were the 8 remaining slave states in the country that hadn't seceded. They all said that if Abraham Lincoln used force and used the military to stop them, then they were going to secede from the Union and they were going to join the South. So Lincoln was stuck in this tough spot. You have Southern rebels who are threatening the lives of American soldiers. As president of the United States, he has to protect American lives. He's not supposed to sit there and just let Southerners take this and possibly kill other Americans. So if you look at this note down here, Abraham Lincoln on April 6th gives the governor of South Carolina a warning saying that he is going to send unarmed supply ships to Fort Sumter just to supply these soldiers. They're not going to have any guns. They're not going to have any weapons. They're there just to like send food and supplies to these soldiers so that they can survive. And they absolutely refused. The South and South Carolina, they refused to let these boats in, and they demanded that Fort Sumter surrender to the South. That leads to 6 days later, the rebels, in the notes I say Rebs for short, the South, they started a 34-hour bombardment where they just launched basically a bunch of rockets into the fort. Eventually, the Union soldiers do surrender after about a day and a half of this. A number of them are killed, and Abraham Lincoln is angry. He declares this an open rebellion in the South, and he orders the Union military at that point to put it down with force. And this is where the Civil War really begins. At that point, coming back to this original map here, Abraham Lincoln became president. These 7 pink states would secede and become the Confederate States, or become the South. After the fall of Fort Sumter, these 4 states, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, they're then going to secede and become part of the Confederacy as well. Richmond, Virginia, which is here in Virginia, Richmond is going to become the capital of the Confederacy. Now, not many people know this, and not many people want to know this part of the history. There are actually 4 slave states that stayed part of the North. They were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Those 4 states here are going to remain part of the North. They don't ban slavery, so they remain slave states, but they don't want to leave and join the South. And sort of a side note as well, West Virginia, this part of the map here, West Virginia hasn't always existed. At the beginning of the Civil War, West Virginia was part of Virginia. But this part of Virginia was opposed to slavery, and they didn't want to secede. So it was actually kind of a sort of an interesting side note. By 1863, West Virginia secedes from Virginia, and they asked to rejoin the United States of America. And that's how we get West Virginia. It's not uncommon once the Civil War begins for a lot of the people in these border states to move, to like literally just go to a new state. So like if you're in Virginia but you're opposed to slavery, you might move up to Pennsylvania. Or if you're in Pennsylvania and you have family in Virginia, you might move down to Virginia and hang out with them. So that wasn't uncommon. The next couple of slides basically just get into basic advantages that the North and South had getting into the rest of the war. The North had some real major advantages. They had a lot more people. There are 22 million more people in the North compared to 9 million people in the South. And even of those 9 million people, about 3 million were slaves. And it's going to be really hard for slave owners in the South to convince black people to fight so they can stay slaves. So there were really only roughly 6 million like real people that were willing to fight to protect slavery in the South, compared to 22 million in the North. The Northern Army was bigger at the beginning of the war. They had about 500,000 soldiers, compared to 250,000 soldiers in the South. Most of the factories were in the North. It was easier to make guns and supplies in the North. There were more railroads in the North. And the North, or the Union, controlled most of the Navy at the beginning of the war. This map here is just actually of there's a map of all the railroads in the United States in 1860, like right before the Civil War begins. So you can see where most of the railroads are. This is a big deal because it's easier to move soldiers and guns and supplies when you have railroads. Otherwise, I mean, if you're in a group of soldiers down here in southern Georgia and you're trying to get up to North Carolina up here, you're marching a lot of the way. Whereas up north, there's a lot more railroads for people to hop on trains and get around the country. So that's a big deal. Now, the southern advantages, they did have some good advantages. First off, the South knew that they didn't have to invade the North. They just had to win a defensive war. They had to be conquered. They knew that in order for the Union, for the North to win, they had to come down to the South and they had to defeat them. That's easier to do, is to win a defensive war. It is harder to win an offensive war. So the Confederates had an easier war to win. Most of the generals in the army actually stayed loyal to the Confederacy. Most of America's best generals were from the South at that time. And probably the best one was Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was from Virginia. He is a well-recognized general. He had served in the Mexican War. Mrs. Clark told me that you'd been learning about Harper's Ferry a little bit. He is the guy who put down the John Brown revolt at Harper's at Harper's Ferry. He personally was opposed to slavery, but he loved his state. So he actually would resign from his general position with the U.S. Army and then go back to Virginia and then take part in the Civil War that way. He is a big deal. Like Robert E. Lee is a Southern hero. And then that gets into sort of the first real battle, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. It goes by one of a couple of names, either the first Battle of Bull Run or the first Battle of Manassas. It depends on if you're from the north or south. We're in the north. We called it the first Battle of Bull Run. Bull Run was just the name of a creek. Real quick, to sort of explain this, Abraham Lincoln wanted this war done fast. He wanted to send the U.S. Army in, smack the South around, hurt them, and basically destroy their revolts in one foul swoop. And they leave from Washington, D.C. up here, if you look at this map, and they run into the Confederate Army at Bull Run. And long story short, the Southern soldiers were ready to fight, the Northern soldiers were not. Even though the Union or the North had more men, the South, they were better trained, and quite frankly, they had better leadership. One leader that is worth mentioning is this guy here with that awesome beard. His name was Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He was given the nickname because he was a stone wall. You don't get through a stone wall. He was one of Robert E. Lee's best generals, and he was an expert at winning defensive battles. And quite frankly, the best way to describe this is that the Union was scared beyond anything I can sort of explain. Um, Stonewall Jackson had actually perfected, I don't know if you've ever heard of the term the rebel yell. I recommend when this is done, watch this video right here. What the rebel yell is. The rebel yell is literally just a bunch of guys in the woods screaming. The Union soldiers never expected to run into a bunch of lunatics in the woods. And when they ran into the Southern Army, the Southern soldiers started screaming and hollering, and it scared the bejesus out of the North. The Northern soldiers didn't know how to fight them. They just turned around and they literally ran. The Union Army had to retreat back to Washington, and it was a horribly embarrassing loss. And this pretty much just lets everybody know that this war is not going to be over like that. It's going to be a big, long, drawn out fight. Like I said, do take a moment, watch this Rebel Yell video, because I mean, I'm not going to sit here and yell and scream because Mrs. Clark will yell at me for yelling and screaming. So you should take a moment, watch this video. It's kind of cool. It'll tell you what the Rebel Yell sounded like, and you'll kind of understand why soldiers in the middle of the woods would kind of get freaked out by this. So, see you, Anakin. Bye.